we're going to discuss this PowerPoint that's already on Canvas for you all to see. So I think you can see that. Let me bring up the chat. All right, so we're going to get right to it. Remember, there's 2 lectures this week. There's this one that I'm doing, and there's another one that I posted on Indigenous Mexico and language. So, and although we will cover a little bit of language today. So Mesoamerica and the formation of the mestizo. We're going to go through this really, really quickly because this PowerPoint you already have on Canvas, so you can review it on your own time. And also this PowerPoint has 80 something slides, I think 86 slides. We're only going to go over maybe half of them, and then you can do the other half on your own time. So Mesoamerica, meso is another word for middle, right? So we're talking about the middle America and the development or the formation of the mestizo. So let's talk about what mestizo is in a couple of slides, not just yet. So let's give some history. So today we're doing a lot of history so that you can understand the readings a little bit better. The Aztecs migrated in 1156 AD from somewhere, they say somewhere in the United States, somewhere like around Utah, Colorado area. Nobody is quite sure, but the history, or some people call it a myth, but it's actually history, states that the Aztecs, the indigenous Mexicans, come from the Four Corner area of the United States. So the Aztecs migrated in 1156 AD, and they did not find Mexico City until 200 years later in 1325. So according to the Aztec myth, the Aztec warrior god Mexicli left instructions to seek a spot where they would see an eagle clutching a serpent with its mouth and its talon. And so they named that spot Tenochtitlan, or Tenochtitlan, or we call it El Distrito Federal or Mexico City, right? But the indigenous term for Mexico City is Tenochtitlan. So on February 19, 1519, so this is 200 years after they landed in what is now known as Mexico City, the Spaniards show up, led by Hernan Cortés, with about 11 ships, over 600 Spaniards, and you can see the rest of the numbers there. So here's a map of Mesoamerica and where people and the rulings that happened throughout history. So in the in the Yucatan Peninsula, you have the Mayan area, the Olmecas a little bit to the west. You have Monte Alban south west of that, and right in the center of Mexico, you have Teotihuacan, and you have Tenochtitlan, which is where the Aztecs settled. So here is a very important slide or picture. This picture is called Plaza de Tres Culturas. So Plaza de Tres Culturas. So I guess the palace or the area of 3 cultures. So it's very easy to see the 3 cultures that exist there. For one, you see the indigenous ruins. That's one culture, right? The second culture is featured or seen right here by the colonial church that's there. So that's the second one, right? That's the sort of like that mestizo that we're talking about, and we're going to continue talking about that in the next minute. And the third culture is the modern Mexican culture that you see in these like modern buildings or this apartment building or whatever. So in this place, you have the 3 cultures coming together. So that's what mestizo is. All Mexicanos are mestizos, which means mixed, essentially. So we had indigenous people living in Mexico, right? When the Spaniards came, you get Spanish people, Spanish blood mixing with indigenous blood. But not only Spanish blood, but the Spaniards have a lot of like Middle Eastern blood as well. So you get all that in the mix of Spanish mixing with indigenous. The Spanish also brought over African slaves, right, through the port of Veracruz. So that's why you have Spanish with a lot of like Middle Eastern influence mixed with indigenous Mexicans, mixed with African peoples that were there in Mexico. By the 1800s, you have like Chinese and Japanese that were landing in Mexico, which is why you have a lot of Chinese, restaurants in the northern part of Mexico, like Tijuana and Mexicali, right? So that process of mixing Spaniards with indigenous and African and all that, whatever the race is called mestizaje, which means cultural mixing. So the process of mixing is called mestizaje, and you're mixing people, you're mixing food, you're mixing language, you're mixing culture, etc. Right? And so therefore, Mexicanos refer to themselves sometimes as mestizos. Either way, they are mestizos because mestizo means mixed. You can't say like I'm 100% native blood if you're alive and you're Mexican in 2022 or whatever year, because um because you have like different racial groups that combined way before you. If anybody has ever done their ancestry.com or 23andMe, you'll realize that. My sister-in-law did, and she's like, "Oh, I didn't had no idea I was part African." I said, yes. Do you not know the history of Mexico? So many. Have you ever been to the state of Veracruz? There's so many like Afro Latinos that live there, Black people in the state of Veracruz, right? You have a lot of French that stayed after the Franco-Mexican War in Jalisco, which is why you get a lot of light-skinned Mexicans in the state of Jalisco, right? So this place, Plaza de Tres Culturas, kind of like actually shows you the three cultures that came together. Um, all right, and this is Mexico today, right? You see kind of modern with the modern cities and all that, not like this one with the old cities, right? So we have, so you can continue to look at all these maps if you like. Here's a very important one. This is Tenochtitlan after the Spaniards, and sorry, before the Spaniards landed in Mexico. So this was a lake, this Valley of Mexico, like you see there, it was a lake. So these Aztecs landed on a lake, and they decided to build their empire on this lake. If you look at a similar picture of this of a similar area, it looks totally different, right? It's all full of, houses and, cities, I guess, little suburbs of Mexico City. So the Spaniards came in, and long story short, they filled um a lot of these like chinampas. They filled a lot of these little roads of water that existed, and this is what it looks like today, which is why I see a lot of churches sinking in Mexico, especially right there in the cathedral. If you've noticed, some of the churches aren't straight, but they're a little crooked because they're actually sitting on top of a lake, right? So here's the explanation of Plaza de Tres Culturas. And you got indigenous Spanish and modern day Mexico, which is a mix of the first two. Identity tells us what we do and who we are, right? So we're gonna get to that today, and also in the lecture that I've already posted. So your identity is who you are. Your identity is who you are not. And the reason we discuss indigenous and even indigenous languages and indigenous culture is because by learning the culture, we understand why we are. So I'll give you a quick example. There's a lot of, I'll give you two quick examples. There's a lot of words that we use in present day that are, whether it's in English or Spanish, that are indigenous Mexican, like the word chocolate. There's actually chocolate or chocolate, right? The word aguacat is avocado. And if you've ever heard of mole, right, that's a sauce. So you get guacamole, you combine those two and you get guacamole, right? Or tomat is tomato, or coyote is coyote, or there's hundreds of words that we use in everyday Spanish and even some English words that have traces back to indigenous Mexico. So that's one example. We still use those uh, that language in our everyday modern Spanish language, right? Another example is our the Aztec language was very possessive, so they would refer to their mother, when amongst other people, as my mother, my mom, even when they were with their brothers, and I don't know if, or sisters. I don't know if you ever noticed Mexicanos do the same thing. Hey, my mom wants you, and you're talking to your brother. It's a Mexicano thing. A lot of like other cultures don't really do that. I remember the first time I had a non-Mexicano over at my house, and my mom was yelling at my brother, and I said, "Hey, my mom wants you." And the guy looked at me and said, "You guys don't have the same mom?" And I said, "Yeah, we do." They're like, "Well, you said my mom. Kind of makes it seem like it's your mom and not his mom." And I said, "Oh yeah, you're right. I don't know. That's just what we say. My mom." A lot of people say that, and a lot of people who are Mexicanos, right? And so that is an indigenous trait. That's how they used to talk. So the idea is that like this possessiveness of this language, which may not be grammatically correct in the way we speak Spanish today, is still present 500, 700 years later. after they spoke this language, right? So let's continue on um, with these slides. These are the groups and the linguistic groups that existed in Mesoamerica. Some more pictures of the sun and the moon pyramids. You guys ever been to a palenque in Mexico? A palenque in Mexico is sort of like an arena where they either like fight roosters or you can go watch concerts. It's almost like a arena or something, but like a very narrow, like a bowl, right? And you sit there and you watch the action going on in the bottom, right? So these palenques actually were indigenous places, things that existed in indigenous Mexico. You can see a small little palenque on this side where they used to play the games with a rubber ball, which we'll talk about later on today if we have time. Here's another picture of another palenque. Here's a picture of Montalban. Um, Here's an actual name. These are just made up pictures here that you see now. The other ones are actual places of people taking pictures with their own cameras. This one here is a drawing because nobody has an actual picture of what indigenous Mexico City looked like. So they call that place Tenochtitlan, but it was also Mexico because the people there referred to themselves as Mexica, not Aztecs. They didn't call themselves Aztecs. We call them Aztecs, but they call themselves Mexica. I am Mexica, or we are Mexica, or we are Mexicanos, because we live in Mexica or Mexico. Their X's, as we'll learn today, were often pronounced as Mexico, right? Which turns into Mexico. A lot of the X's turn into J's. So it's no longer Mexico or Mexica or Mexicano, it's Mexicano, right? Like it's no longer like Jalisco, like the state of Jalisco where my mom is from. It's Jalisco. We traded that X in for a J, right? Um, let's see. Here's another picture of what that might have looked like. Mexico Tenochtitlan. All right, so let's talk about terminology and point of view. So this is my opinion of how we should refer to in regard to indigenous Mexico. When we're talking about indigenous Mexico, we should not call it pre-Columbian because essentially you're giving the credit to Columbus. If you're going to talk about a beautiful culture that was rich in many facets, why are you going to name it after a person that had nothing to do with it, as Christopher Columbus? So we're not going to call that pre-Columbian history. Um, we don't want to call it pre-Cortesian history because Hernan Cortés is known as the person who conquered Mexico, right? A lot of Mexicanos don't like Hernan Cortés, right? He was the one that conquered Mexico. So why are we going to give him credit? Pre-Hispanic, there's a lot of problems with that word Hispanic. A lot of people don't use it. I, for one, don't call myself a Hispanic. People ask me, what are you? I'm a Mexicano. Or some people say I'm a Chicano or I'm Chicanex or X, Y, or Z, whatever, right? And some people have problems with the term Chicano. Some people have problems with the term Chicanex. Some people have problems with the term Mexican American. I understand all those terms, but the one I really don't understand is Hispanic, right? I kind of understand what it means, like Spanish speaking. But again, why are we giving credit to Spain for this beautiful time period that we're talking about? Pre-Spanish, why are we naming this pre-Spanish and using the word Spanish or Spain in the name when we're talking about something that has nothing to do with Spain? Pre-conquest, I also don't like the word conquest, even though I think I've said it once or twice already. Mexico wasn't conquered. I mean, it's still there. And there's still plenty of people that speak indigenous languages, right? So maybe one of the words that we can use is pre-Cuauhtemoc. Cuauhtemoc was the last Aztec emperor that was captured by the Spaniards. So if we're gonna say pre something, might as well call it pre-Cuauhtemoc. Mexico City had a larger population in 1492 than Spain did. And colonization is not the wiping out of indigenous, but the mixing of people. So you really didn't wipe them out, which is why we don't like to call it conquest. Um, let's talk about, I think I talk about dialect in the next one, so we're gonna skip that for a second. Let's talk about this terminology, more terminology. So the word Indian or Indio in Spanish is looked down upon. For example, there's this term, maybe you've heard it, se le salió lo indio, which means You usually say that when somebody is drinking or drunk, when they do something as a drunk person. Se le salió lo indio, which is a derogatory, which is negative viewpoint of indigenous people, saying that they're always drunk, right? Even this person who is not indigenous, and you're saying se le salió lo indio, you're basically using the indigenous name in a bad way, right? So let's talk about religion. I believe in something. I follow a religion. You might follow a religion, and religion means to religion, like religion. Legion means to connect, like Legos, right? Comes from that word, like liga, like that connects your hair or ties your hair together, right? So religion means to reconnect. And the Pontis is a tool that we use, or the bridge, um, to get to, if in the case of Catholicism or Christianity, to God, right? Because there's a disconnection. There was some sort of disconnection. That's why people get baptized so that they can enter God's grace or whatever. And we don't need to get into the specifics of religion, but if you know about Christianity and Catholicism, there's a disconnect, and we're attempting to reconnect. That's why we call it religion. Well, in indigenous Mexico, there is no disconnection. They never disconnected from their gods. They're one with their gods. They pray to them. They didn't put their God on the cross and nail him to the cross or whatever and kill him. They didn't do none of that. So therefore, we cannot call their beliefs a religion, because it's actually not a religion, because the definition of religion means to reconnect. So let's not call it that. Maybe we call it something else, but not that, a belief or whatever, but we're not going to call it that, right? So like down here we have there's a lot of issues with like sacrifice and cannibalism that existed in indigenous Mexico. Some people say that especially like the older historians and the older books that were coming out maybe like 75, 80 years ago were saying the Aztec Empire killed itself because of all the sacrifices. And yes, the Aztecs did sacrifice, but that word sacri and vice, if you put them together, it means making worthy. That doesn't necessarily mean to kill somebody, right? Sacrifice doesn't necessarily mean to kill somebody. I can sacrifice a loaf of bread to my son. It doesn't mean I'm killing anybody, right? So sacrifice is a term that oftentimes is connected with the killing of people in indigenous Mexico, and that's not always true, right? So we got to get that out of our heads. So and cannibalism also, but I think by throwing those two terms around, like sacrifice and cannibalism, the Spaniards justified the killing of the indigenous. There was about 25 million indigenous people that existed in Mexico by the time the Spaniards landed. And by the time that war was over, there was like more than 90% were gone. So I think 24 to 25 million people perished by war, by famine, but also by one of the probably the big one out of all those three is diseases, right? And just like in the United States, where there's documents that prove that smallpox was spread on purpose to the natives to kill them off, the same thing was happening in Mexico. You spread smallpox because you know they cannot fight it, because they've never been exposed to it and their bodies aren't immune to any of that stuff, right? So you know, how can you justify the fact that you're killing over 90% of the population in Mexico? Well, say, well, they were less than human. In fact, they were sacrificing each other, and it was the whole group of them were like cannibals. So and people like, oh, you killed a cannibal. That's fine, no worries. It's a cannibal. We don't really care about cannibals. They're less than human. So here is three words: Mexicano, the one in the middle, also known as Aztec, and they spoke that top word right there, Nahuatl. It's not Nahuatl. I don't see an O in there anywhere. Do not say Nahuatl ever. It's Nahuatl. Nahuatl, right? Nahuatl. And there's a couple of slides here on language families and stuff, and we're gonna skip some of those and talk about pronunciation. So how do you pronounce some of these words? So they usually have the accent or the stress on the second to the last syllable. So for example, Acapulco, right? Acapulco has four syllables, and you're gonna stress the second to the last one, right? Acapulco. It's not Acapulco or Acapulco. It's Acapulco. Tenochtitlan, Jalisco, Guadalajara. Um, Mazatlan's a little bit different because we pronounce the last one as strong. Mazatlan. Here it's Mazatlan. So a lot of people who study the Nahuatl language would say it's used to be called Mazatlan, and for some reason we changed it to Mazatlan. Jalisco, right? Guanajuato. This accent on the second to the last syllable. So words that end in TL, like at, which means water, like coyote, which it's not coyotl, which means coyote, like tomat, which means tomato, like chocolate, which means chocolate. The X, as we said before, is like shalishko, shalapan, chic tomat. What do you think chic tomat is? Remember the X changed to a from an SH to a J. So it's no longer chic tomat, but he toma. And usually the T and the L, like in the example above, coyote turned into coyote. You change the L to an E and you get coyote, right? So let's look at this word, chic tomat, jitomate. It means tomato, right? Chic tomat was jitomate. It turned into jitomate. The double L stands for L, not like pollo, right? But like chili, like moli, like tamale. Those are words that we still use today, right? Mexico, gamotli, which is a camote, nopali, which are nopales, so words that we use today. And the HU is pronounced as W, aguacat, which is aguacate, avocado. Nahuatl, which is the language that they spoke, um, that the Aztecs spoke. There were over 150 languages, I think, that existed in indigenous Mexico. Purépecha, Zapotec, etc. Nahuatl. There's a whole bunch of them, right? Nahuatl was one of the biggest ones. Here's another word, huehuet, which means it's the name of a drum. So let's skip some of these Nahuatl place names and let's get to let's get to some of these other issues that we wanted to talk about. Um, cenotes, that's a cool issue. I think if we have time, we'll get back to it. But let's talk about food that they ate. Maize, as in what do you make with maize and or elot? You make corn tortillas, and that's a big staple of Mexican identity. That's a big staple of Mexico. What do Mexicans eat? Tortillas, right? Tortillas made of maize, made of corn, right? But they have a variety of chiles or stuff that they add to the food like chiles, tomate, limas, potatoes, peanuts. The type of meat that they ate were fish, deer, rabbit, iguana, turtle. This whole like carne asada thing did not exist in indigenous Mexico. We weren't eating carne asada back then, and we weren't chugging beers. That was brought over by the Europeans, right, with their cows. So we think we're so like Mexicano by listening to corridos, by eating carne asada and drinking our beer on the weekends. And that's like far from Mexico as you can put it. The corridos are often played by accordions, which came from Germany. And those rhythms, whatever they are, those are German rhythms that they come from over there. The carne asada comes from Europe, right? Including the drink, the beer comes from over there. We had a different type of drink, which was similar to like mezcal and tequila called pulque, right? But that was different than actual beer. The chocolate, the chocolate is actually very different than how we experience chocolate now. It was actually spicy. For some reason, people in Mexico they like spicy stuff in addition to like their sweet stuff. So for example, you go get a you get an elote. What do you put on your elote? like butter and salt and lime, but then you also put tajin chile, right? So you get something sweet and you add spice to it. When you go to those like colorful umbrellas and you order like a fruit cocktail, what do you put with your piña and your what, jamaica and your mango and your whatever watermelon? You put lemon and you put salt, and then what else do you put? A whole mess of chile in there, right? For some reason, Mexicanos love the sweetness, but also chile on top of everything. Pretty interesting, right? Just like our mole that it's like a sauce that you put on like top of chicken. Depending on where you're from in Mexico, they make it different, but it's like chocolate or peanut sauce, but with chile in it all at the same time. So the chocolate was actually spicy chocolate. I've never had indigenous chocolate before. I don't know how that tastes, but like it says there, they were using peppers and not sugars. But chocolate was invented in Mexico. Um, Before we get to the cenotes, let's talk about Oaxaca and the cochinelle bug. The cochinelle bug is this bug that you see here magnified many, many times that you find on these nopales. I'm sure you've all seen nopales, and I'm sure you've all seen the white stuff that exists on them. If you squeeze it or break it, it actually turns red. It's not because it's your blood, it's actually like the dye or the liquid that comes from the bug. So the cochinelle bug in the 1500s and the early 1600s becomes the number one export out of Mexico. When I learned this, it blew my mind because I assumed it was like copper or silver or maybe even gold or something, but it was the cochinelle bug because a lot of people who are royalty in Spain and in different parts of Europe dress in red, and it's very hard to make red dye. You have to use like animal blood or something, and now we got a bug that is in abundance all over Mexico. There's so many nopales that grow naturally in the wild all over Mexico, and they all have this cochinelle bug. So you scrape it off, and you take that to Spain or Italy or Europe or whatever, and now you got easy red dye that you can work with. So let's talk about these cenotes and what all that means. Here are some Nahuatl words. Se means one, like se, ome, for example. Those are the numbers, right? So there's this theory that the Aztec Empire was so widespread that it even spread in places like the United States, for example. Mich means fish, like Michoacan, but also there's all these Great Lakes in Michigan, right? So it kind of makes you think like, why is like Michigan so similar sounding to Michoacan, and they actually have the same root word, which is Mich, which means fish. Makes you think that they had been trading all this time and the language kind of got shared, right? Or for example, Seattle, which you have that big lake there as well. One water, Seat. There's a lot of people that theorize that that's the original name of Seattle. Some people claim that it was named after a Native American man, and other people, especially in Mexico, are claiming that no, this is a Nahuatl word that got changed over time, but it means one water, se at Seattle, right? So you got this at, which means many things in addition to water. But if you notice, like if you look at a map of the world and you compare it to like Pangea, you see this, right? So you saw it be like this puzzle that fit together. Africa fit right perfectly on South America, and Australia fit right here perfectly by like India and Africa and all that stuff. And everything fits so perfect together. It was like a ball of land, and then everything changed. It kind of makes you wonder, like some people say no, Pangea existed, and some people say it did not exist, but there's a lot of words that are found in like Indian culture that have not only the same sound, but the same definition all the way down here in indigenous Mexico. It's impossible for people to travel from India to Mexico in the 13, 14, 1500s and even before. It's literally impossible, right? But it kind of makes you wonder and understand that maybe this super like continent actually did exist, because you have very, very similar words that are found in this part of the world as in Mexico. Not only are they the same sounding, but they also have the same definition. For example, Maya means illusion in India, and Maya means illusion in Mexico. Kind of interesting in that indigenous language. So here's the thing that blows my mind. If you study the cenotes in Mexico, first of all, cenote is like a hole in the ground. If you ever seen the movie Coco, do you remember the part where what's his name? I just saw the movie yesterday. I should know. Miguel gets thrown into this big water hole when he discovers that. I don't want to spoil the movie for you all, but when he discovers that, oh, I forget his name. What is it? That he has family in the underworld, right? So when he gets thrown into that hole, that's a cenote, right? And they're very beautiful. You can see pictures of them here. You can swim in them. It's very beautiful. If you, especially if you go to the Yucatan Peninsula. Oh, sorry. Speaking of those words, here's a list of them. You can go over them. Like yoga means on top of the truth, and yoga means on top of the truth. Chakra means the four centers of the body, like chakra, right? So you see, I listed only like five or six of them. So a lot of people in Mexico will claim that when the meteor hit, if you go here, like it hits somewhere here, which is why if you put everything together and you spread it apart, in other words, you put everything together here, like Pangea, and you spread it apart, like you still have this hole, this massive hole in the Gulf of Mexico, which is why a lot of people say that's where the actual meteor hit, right? And so what's interesting is that these holes in the grounds, what you see right here, like you see a cenote here, see a cenote here, they're like sort of connected and all the way to the ocean. How can you have like, if there's no circulation there, how can you have like live, you know, and a lot of them are saltwater. How can you have live animals, saltwater animals in saltwater if there's no filtration? Because there is filtration because they all lead to here. So if you notice here, this is like all these sort of like green little dots are all the cenotes that exist in Mexico. It's kind of interesting that they almost form this perfect, like it's too perfect of a semicircle of all these cenotes that exist in Mexico. Makes you wonder. It's almost like when you're stepping on like sort of like wet sand and you step and then like the pressure of your foot creates like little pockets of air like on the sides of your foot, like little holes. I don't know if you ever noticed it before. It's almost like it's a very similar thing, right? So a lot of Mexicanos will claim that these cenotes that you see like right here and all the other pictures are a product of that. So we only got through like 60 slides and there's a lot more. So I want you to go over them. You know, the ending of the Aztec calendar is sort of like explained here. And we talk about music as well and the meaning of music in indigenous culture. We talk about modernity, the decolonial perspective in these slides, and the idea of Latin America. So I want you to check out these slides and also the other lecture that I posted and make sure you go over them before you actually answer the discussion question that's due next week, or sorry, on Wednesday. So you can see it right there. Discussion number one. That's all you have to do this week. Answer discussion number one, March 23rd by midnight, right? Or whatever date that we put up there. So let me stop sharing this screen. I'm gonna stop recording.